My name is Philip Heedy. I'm product manager on the ArcGIS for Server team, and with me, my colleague.
I'm Shannon Kaliski, and I'm also product manager on the server team.
Between the two of us, we're going to try over the next 75 minutes to give what I consider a relatively high-level overview of Web GIS, what it is, trying to put some motivation behind this term that we keep using at the conference and have used for quite a while, and then get into some of the different architectures as well as the patterns and practices that goes with deciding how to architect a Web GIS. So just to get everybody started and get some of that energy flowing, how many of you today use ArcGIS online in one form or another? A show of hands. That's pretty much everybody. Excellent. How many of you have set up what I would term your own Web GIS using ArcGIS for Server in your own infrastructure? By show of hands. Wow. Good crowd. So representing the software side, meaning not the SaaS model, the ArcGIS Online model here, we deal with ArcGIS for Server, Portal for ArcGIS, and so on a daily basis. But for this session, we're representing the whole breadth of potential Web GIS deployment patterns. So with that said, let's try to talk about what we actually think Web GIS is. So given that most of you raised your hand with having set up a Web GIS using ArcGIS for Server, I'm guessing that those same people, all of you, already use what I would term Server GIS, using classic ArcGIS Server, map services, feature services, and so forth. Show of hands? Yes, okay. How many of you in the past have used things like the Flex Viewer, the Silverlight Viewer, or maybe even created your own custom applications on top? I would expect more or less the same people. Now, by now, you're all tired of raising your hand. Excellent. So WebGIS is not about going away from that model. It's about transforming that model into something new and hopefully more productive. The desktop never goes away. That is still where you maintain your data. That's where you author your maps. This is ArcMap and now increasingly ArcGIS Pro as well. When you go into a WebGIS model, that doesn't mean servers go away. Servers is what actually powers the WebGIS, but they go somewhat more into the background, as opposed to being front and center in a more server-centric, I would call it, approach, where you have to think a lot about underlying services, how you model those services into apps, and so forth. They become the workhorses sitting in the back office. When we're talking about a pure SaaS model through ArcGIS Online, you may not even be running those servers yourselves, maintaining them, upgrading them, but they certainly still exist. We have an entire team in Redlands and in other teams spread across the world whose sole job it is to keep all of the infrastructure that powers ArcGIS Online up and running 24/7. So coming from the server-centric point of view, classic ArcGIS Server, how is that different from WebGIS? WebGIS we often talk about is about reuse of services and data and layers in multiple different applications across different types of devices. But isn't that to some extent also what we said Server GIS was about? You could publish your web services once and then reuse them across many different types of applications. It was. However, what we often saw, by no means exclusively, but often, was that Server GIS ended up being siloed use of those services within custom applications. Instead of getting that reuse when you had some kind of audience with some requirements, you built an app, and then we powered those apps by underlying services coming from your geodatabases, your file geodatabases, shape files, whatever the data might be. But we rarely got to the point where those services were easily reusable across other types of applications, other types of devices. What happened far too often was that when another use case came along, we ended up building new services because you needed slightly different symbology. Now that you were all of a sudden targeting, let's say, a tablet as opposed to a browser, you needed to tweak things just ever so slightly. So instead of getting that reuse, we got a proliferation of closely related but slightly different services. And we kept doing that as we now targeted cell phones, smartphones, whatever it might be, and so on and so forth. So we just kept on going and going. We got the nice web service approach, but we really didn't reap all of the benefits. That's one big part of what we say Web GIS is about trying to solve. Instead of having to create slightly different variations of the same underlying services over and over again, we're trying to create a platform that makes it easy to make pervasive use of what we call web layers, scenes, that's 3D, and maps within all of the ArcGIS apps, meaning the apps that Esri creates, the apps that our business partners create, as well as the apps that you create using either the story maps, configurable app templates, web app builder, maybe even slightly customized versions of Web App Builder using the developer edition, all the way over to pure custom applications created using the runtime SDKs and the APIs. It's a complete spectrum of apps, and all of the apps within that framework are able to make pervasive use of all of those layers, scenes, and maps. So now, that platform is really what we term Web GIS. You'll notice that the same data is still there under the hood. There are still services powering all of these things, but they get abstracted away by the portal, which is a central part of the WebGIS infrastructure. And in this sense, I'm using the word portal in an abstract way. I'm not necessarily referring to portal for ArcGIS, and I'll get back to why I stress that. The portal is the central managing component that makes it possible to share out those web maps and scenes and layers. It becomes the repository for what, from a technical point of view, you can even think of as configuration files. These are configuration files. These are items that are widely understood across the entire ArcGIS platform by whatever means that platform is actually exposed, through ready-to-use apps or all the way over to those custom applications we talked about. We've taught all of our APIs and SDKs and everything built upon them to read and understand these items. So with that infrastructure in place, we can now try to achieve that goal from before, which was to make use of the same services, the same data, the same layers and maps across multiple different types of apps, multiple different types of devices. And hopefully, we don't get into the N+1 of having to recreate things over and over again. Now we can abstract a layer up and make use of the same underlying layers in new types of maps and tweak those maps and layers at that level as opposed to publishing out entirely new services. That's a very powerful idea, and the idea behind the rest of this session is to try to explain the different options for how you choose a pattern that best fits you. So, just one last time, by show of hands, who have not seen this diagram? One. Have not seen the diagram before. That was a trick question. I expected very few people to raise their hands. It's a tough crowd.
Yes.
If you've been to any kind of Esri presentation within the last, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years, there's a very good chance you will have seen this diagram. So let's try to tease this diagram a little bit apart. What is it exactly we're trying to say with the diagram, and what will we focus on for the rest of this session? The diagram tries to represent more or less the same that I had on the previous slide. There's those users and apps on top, and it doesn't matter where those apps are coming from. Again, Esri built, business partner built, or apps that you build yourselves using everything from app builders, templates, all the way to runtime SDKs and APIs. That's not the focus of this session, because if we're actually successful with the vision behind the Web GIS that I just outlined, it doesn't matter what they're connecting up to. They just need to connect to that infrastructure. What is interesting is that portal in the middle. How do I get one of those? What do I have to do? How do I make use of it? The servers underneath, where are they hosted? Am I running software myself in my infrastructure? Literally in my basement or under my desk? Is it running in the cloud? Is Esri running it in the cloud? Is somebody else running it in the cloud for me, or in just a traditional data center? And then base maps and utility services, other types of content and services, we'll touch briefly upon that. But the main focus will be those two other pieces, the portal and the GIS servers underneath. So let's try to answer that question. How do I get one of these portals? There's two main approaches today. There's ArcGIS for Server, and there's ArcGIS Online. The first is software with everything that comes with that approach. So Portal for ArcGIS is a component that ships with ArcGIS for Server as a whole. Because it's software, we release once, maybe twice a year. Typically no more than one major release at most per year. Just because I like to get a feel, and I think this is a slightly different crowd than what we usually do presentations for, at least what I usually do presentations for, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands one more time. I'm sorry. How many of you are using ArcGIS for Server, whether Portal is in the picture or not, 10.4x, latest release series? 10.3x? 10.2x? Okay. Prior to 10.2x? A few people. All right. So we've started releasing at a slightly faster cadence than what we did in years past, but we're still releasing by what the IT community as a whole, at least parts of the IT community as a whole, would consider fairly slow pace. On the other hand, I hear many of you telling me throughout this week and on a fairly regular basis that you can barely keep up. So that's an interesting challenge for us. Nonetheless, software, we will never, I predict, release more than at most once or twice per year. When we do so, as you can attest to those of you who didn't raise your hand on 10.4x, you have to upgrade manually. How many of you enjoy upgrading manually? Very few people do. So one very enthusiastic person here up in front. When we release, you have to decide when the right time is to upgrade. You have to plan for it. You now have to go through a process to make sure that you don't have excessive downtime. You get to have all the fun of running through a dev and a staging and a test and who knows what types of environments you have before you actually put it into production. And we know that is a long and often tedious process because it's just no fun. At the end of the day, hopefully you get some benefit out of it. That's why we've released the new software. That really leads into the next one. With the software approach, your organization controls the service level agreement, the SLA for your setup. You're the one who decides the type of architecture, what types of machines, where those machines are running. Is it a highly available environment? Do you have a disaster recovery plan? Exactly what does your disaster recovery plan entail? Can you live with a few hours, days, weeks of data loss? None at all. There's a very wide spectrum, and that's not an easy choice to make or an easy thing to plan for. All of that comes with the software approach. On the other side is the SaaS model, the software as a service model. This is ArcGIS Online. ArcGIS Online releases at a fairly fast cadence compared to the software. 3 to 4 times per year, a new release is made available. When that happens, you literally just have to press refresh in your browser, and you can now take advantage of everything else that's come with the upgrade. We just had a new release of ArcGIS Online here a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Coming from the software side, that's amazing because I woke up one day and I saw the email that said, now we've released, and that's pretty impressive. We have an entire DevOps team who takes care of all of those details. So that upgrade just comes along automatically. We control the SLA on the other hand. So we guarantee 3 nines worth of uptimes, 99.9. That's actually quite a lot, but some of you have higher requirements. So maybe that's a reason you need to set up your own software. Others, you could only dream of setting up a 99.9 available environment, and in which case such an SLA is excellent. Doesn't matter which one of these two approaches you pick, however, the core WebGIS functionality is the same between them. You have the same advanced visualization capabilities. You have the same smart mapping capabilities. You have the same analysis capabilities. Those core features do not differ between the two models. There are certainly nuances to this. I'll get into some of those nuances here in just a second. But the core message is that those features do not differ dramatically. When we get into things like enterprise integration, you do start seeing a little bit of a divergence. One of the reasons for that is simply the fact of being able to run within your data center versus running in the cloud under a setup that we control. So with ArcGIS for Server, we have a whole list of different types of enterprise integration options. We do what we call enterprise logins. That's what's listed here as Web Single Sign-On via SAML. That's a protocol for doing federated identity management through other identity providers, so we can piggyback off of that. That's a feature that we support both in ArcGIS for Server and, as it happens, as we'll see in just a second, with ArcGIS Online. But because we're running in your infrastructure, we can also connect up to groups coming from things like Active Directory or LDAP. We can do other types of integration via Windows authentication, using your domain accounts. All of those features are possible because we're running right next to that other IT infrastructure. ArcGIS Online, by virtue of running in the cloud, doesn't have quite all the same capabilities. On the other hand, it is a lot easier to set up because, well, you don't set anything up. ArcGIS for Server also comes with the full GIS server itself. This is the classic ArcGIS server where you get all the capabilities of dynamic map services published off your own databases, live data connections. This is geoprocessing services where you can publish out your own custom analysis functionality. This is everything from your own locators to network analysis and so on and so forth. On the other hand, in ArcGIS Online, Esri provides a whole lot of content and other services. Not just the base maps, which are probably the most widely consumed piece of content within ArcGIS Online, but also the living atlas layers, the services such as geo-enrichment, the ability to take your own data and enrich it with demographic information. Many, many different types of layers available across the world. Routing. We have a world routing service, and I'm going to guess that very few of you have a worldwide street network available in your own infrastructure. So we can make that available because we have that infrastructure too. So there's pros and cons to each. You get some very flexible patterns with one. You get a whole lot of out-of-the-box functionality with very little effort with the other. So how in the world do you choose between one or the other? We'll try to address that here in just a second. So with that setup, we've got the two main patterns. Let's try to tease that middle cloud, that lovely fluffy cloud, a little bit apart. And the reason I want to get into this, even though we're at a relatively high level, just break it apart a little bit and get into the individual software components, because this is a very common question we get. And I want to make sure that there's a clear understanding of what it means when we say a WebGIS set up using the software. So when we look at that cloud in the middle of the diagram, when we're talking about ArcGIS Online, that cloud really just is. You don't have to install anything. You don't have to worry about the infrastructure. Where does your data actually live? Well, in the cloud. Great. Where is that cloud? Well, it just so happens there's a little bit of Amazon Web Services in there. There's a little bit of Microsoft Azure. Those are implementation details. And unless you actively start looking at your network traces and see where your requests go, you would really never notice. If I hadn't just said it, how many of you knew that we were using something like Microsoft Azure? A couple of surprisingly large amounts of people. Guys should stop doing network traces. All right. However, if you do set up the software yourself, it's not just one single component that you have to install and manage. Using ArcGIS for Server, the main component that you probably interact with and think of when we're talking about a WebGIS is Portal for ArcGIS. Portal for ArcGIS is the user-facing piece, and many times when we're talking about such a setup, we say that we're using Portal. Under the hood, though, there's also a hosting server, or there should be at least. If you don't have one, we should talk. ArcGIS server is really what's powering that hosting server in the middle. And then at the very bottom, we have what's known as ArcGIS Data Storage, another software component that we ship. And I just want to give a little bit of motivation for why those three software components are actually required to be set up together to give you full WebGIS capabilities. One of the key factors of a WebGIS is that when you're publishing data, we'll get into some nuance, but generally when you're publishing data as through what we call a hosted layer, you're copying the data to the servers. In ArcGIS Online, well, that just happens somewhere behind the scenes like I mentioned. But when you're running the software yourself, that data has to go somewhere. Somewhere a service has to be spun up and actually pointing to that data to make it available. We need a REST endpoint, to be very technical about it. ArcGIS Data Store is where that data goes. So when you drag and drop a CSV file into the map viewer or whatever it might be, that's the database it goes into. So it's a database that we ship as part of a component. The hosting server is where a service is then actually spun up, pointing to that data, making it available. And ultimately, it becomes what we term a feature layer within the portal itself. So because you install the software, you get to have the privilege, the fun, of actually making sure that that infrastructure is present. So going back to the two different patterns for use of ArcGIS for server, I mentioned server GIS doesn't go away. So I just want to give a little bit more motivation for what I mean when I say server GIS. This is really talking about more classic use of ArcGIS server connecting to your own data sources. In this case, I'm just saying an enterprise geodatabase, but you can mentally translate that into whatever other data source you might be using in addition to that. Shapefiles are fair game, even if I do want you to stop using shapefiles. This could be your own database servers through things like query layers, but the defining part of server GIS is often, not necessarily always, but often the fact that you're connecting out to live data sources. These data sources are under your control. You haven't made a copy and handed it over to us. You may be making copies for other reasons, for publication reasons, but they're still data sources that are under your control as opposed to Esri managed. The WebGIS infrastructure on the left-hand side, and I'm being a little bit server-centric, I'm biased after all, but that's where you will turn over the data to us for hosting and management. The two things work incredibly well together. One thing does not replace the other. That's something that I really want to stress because it's something we get a lot of questions about. How do I replace my existing server with one of those WebGIS things? That's really not what it's about. It's a supplement to your server. It's a new way of exposing those same services through new different types of applications by virtue of those web maps, web layers, and scenes. All right. That was a lot of preamble. The next slide here is really what I consider the main part of my section of this presentation. When we're talking about WebGIS deployment patterns, we generally see 5 different categories. All 5 of them are equally valid, and it all depends on your particular requirements. So first, we have the 2 different patterns, the overall patterns of how to set up a WebGIS. There's the software and the SaaS models, ArcGIS Online, and the software that you can install somewhere yourself. And notice I say customer managed infrastructure. That's really just to try to distinguish it from online where it's Esri managed. I don't care where that infrastructure is. Oftentimes we get into a little bit of a trap in our terminology where ArcGIS Online becomes synonymous with the cloud. That's a little bit too confusing for me because, yes, online itself runs using cloud resources, but you can deploy the software just as well in the cloud. I want you to deploy the software in the cloud because we're doing a lot of great things to enhance that particular deployment pattern for the software. So when we're talking about ArcGIS for server, it can be literally on premises, somewhere in your basement. It can be in a traditional data center, or what often these days gets called a private cloud. I think that's a fancy term for a data center. It can be the public cloud. Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, whatever other public cloud that you might want to use. As long as it meets our basic system requirements, go for it. We have specific additional images pre-built for AWS and Azure. We have tooling, but you can absolutely deploy in, let's say, IBM SoftLayer or whatever other cloud that you may want to. You can also subcontract out to other people to manage this software for you. You need some of the functionality, maybe you need dedicated infrastructure, whatever the reason, and you can use something like Esri's own managed cloud services or other types of business partners who can run the infrastructure for you. At the end of the day, what I'm trying to differentiate with here is whether the software is at some level installed just for you or you're part of ArcGIS Online. So when we come at it from the ArcGIS Online point of view, beginning with that, that's very common for newer customers that we talk to. First getting started with GIS, because it's really easy to get started with. You don't have to install any software. You literally just get an ArcGIS Online organization and you're up and running. That's the first pattern. You can do a lot of things just with that model. You can take advantage of all of the apps. You can take advantage of services up to a certain point. There's functionality that doesn't exist, but if you don't need that functionality, why even worry about it? That's where a lot of organizations get started these days. Maybe a little bit of desktop, maybe a little bit of ArcGIS Online. The next one over here is what we, a couple of years ago, often referred to as the hybrid pattern, as though that was the only hybrid pattern. It is absolutely still a viable option. It's still what I would call part of the hybrid patterns. This is where you have your classic standalone ArcGIS server and you simply front it with ArcGIS Online. It's a very fast and easy way to get started with Web GIS without having to install and maintain additional software above what you're already doing. So we saw a lot of server customers go this path, particularly a couple of years ago before Portal for ArcGIS became widely available and widely deployed. We still see many customers going this route because, like I said, it's really fast and easy to get started with. Coming from the other side of the diagram, though, if we're beginning with server GIS on premises, this is something that you've been running in your own infrastructure, wherever that infrastructure may be, for a while, is that classic standalone ArcGIS server. The new thing is adding the portal infrastructure up in front of it. Now, I just want to reiterate, when I say the portal and I have that fluffy cloud on there, I'm referring to those three software components. I'm not talking about just installing the one Portal for ArcGIS component and putting it in front of an existing server necessarily. Even if that is where you end up, deployment-wise, that should be an explicit choice that you make after looking at how many machines do you want to run, what's the functionality you need. Logically, I think of the two patterns, the Web GIS with the three software components and the server GIS as being logically distinct. You can choose and end up deploying them using the same hardware infrastructure, but logically they're two separate entities, shown here on the diagram with the cloud and the ArcGIS server box underneath. This is a pattern that we often see for organizations that, for whatever reason, can't or is barred from taking advantage of the open internet. This is the disconnected scenario. Maybe there's just policies internal to the organization that prevents it. Maybe there's regulations. You're dealing with types of data that just
isn't allowed to go outside your own firewall. There can be lots of reasons to go for that pattern, and we support it, and we support it well. The next pattern over is a really interesting one in my mind. You still have all of that infrastructure running within your own firewall, or at least running within the network in a way that makes it internal to you. But this is for the organizations that do have the ability to reach out to the open internet, to opportunistically take advantage of some of those content and service things that we make available and other third-party providers make available. So this is the ability to reach out, for example, for base maps. And I would venture a guess that quite a lot of you fall into that category. Even if you are actually running all of the software yourself, you're very likely taking advantage of base maps in one form or another, unless you are truly on the far right of the diagram where you can't go out to the open internet. So this is where you can start supplementing your Web GIS with some of the utility services that we also make available. It doesn't have to just be base maps. You need to do some street network routing. Well, instead of having to set up and acquire or maintain your own street network, you could take advantage of that world routing service from Esri, even if you're running all of the software yourself otherwise. So that's taking opportunistic advantage of the internet. And then we converge on what is becoming a much more prevalent pattern and something that we're focusing very heavily on from Esri's side with new functionality going forward. This is where you start having a little bit of everything. I like that model. That means that all of the hard work that we do on a regular basis is made available to you. It does come with some interesting challenges, though. All of a sudden, you have to start making a much more conscious decision of where does my data actually go? Why am I putting it in one place versus the other? What is my data management and update policies and so forth? But this is where you have both the full ArcGIS for Server stack running in your own infrastructure, as well as making use of ArcGIS Online. The distinction between this pattern and the one I was just talking about is that you're no longer just reaching out to take advantage of content and services from the open internet. You're actually making active, you're taking active use of ArcGIS Online, meaning you're having two systems of engagement, if you will. So why would you end up doing something like that? We see a lot of different reasons for it, but I'll just highlight a couple. One very common reason for this pattern that we see is particularly in the local government and state government space here in the US and across the world for different types of political jurisdictions. This is where you maintain certain data internally. This is maybe parcel information, other types of sensitive information for law enforcement, whatever it might be that has to stay within your own infrastructure. But as you make data available to the general public, instead of trying to host those services and host that data yourself, it's possible to simply turn it over to ArcGIS Online. So when those snowplow maps, or whatever it might be, go viral, when everybody wants to know something that's going on in their local neighborhood, you don't have to scale and maintain all that infrastructure yourself. Because again, very few people really enjoy having to deal with that overloaded server early in the morning and adding extra capacity. That's what the cloud is really good for. That's what a SaaS model, where we take the responsibility of scaling that cloud for you. Conversely, another reason we often see for organizations going into this model is for collaboration with external third parties. Sometimes it can be really hard to get other third parties, whether they're contractors or somebody else, and give them access to your internal network. Who needs to fill out the VPN request? How do I get them an AD account? Whatever it might be, it can actually be a lot faster and easier to simply have an external system. In this case, ArcGIS Online is what's considered external to make that possible. You collect your data, you do your collaboration, whatever it might be, in online, and then you bring that data back down into your internal systems for QA, QC, and updates. And this can be a cycle. Once you've done that, pushing the new data back up into online to continue the data collection process, and so on and so forth. Lots of different reasons for why this is a very powerful pattern. Like I mentioned, this is possible today, but we're also focusing a lot of work in this area. I won't get into too much detail, but I will make a short plug for the Road Ahead session that we have, I think, immediately following this. I'm going right over there. About what we're terming distributed Web GIS. That's this idea that there's not necessarily just a single portal, whether it's online or in your infrastructure. You might have yourself multiple portals because you're spread across geographic regions, because you want to take advantage of both online infrastructure and your own infrastructure. There could be lots of reasons. And we want to support that pattern even better than what we do today. We want to productize some of the workflows that today involves custom development. So making it easier to get data to and from different portals, bringing that data down and then pushing it back up. So we'll talk more about that in the road ahead. If you were in the plenary on Monday, you may have seen a passing reference by Jack to this functionality as well. I think the title of the slide during the plenary was ArcGIS Portal Replication. I'm not a big fan of the word replication, if only because it sounds like geodatabase replication. That's not what this is. This is something different. So distributed Web GIS is really where we do see this leading to. Naturally, over time, for lots of different reasons, whether political or simply geographic or whatever they might be reasons, a lot of organizations are already telling us that they see a need for distributed portals. So we'll focus a lot more on that. That was a fairly high-level overview of those different patterns. And I'll go back here just quickly before turning it over to Shannon. I saw a lot of people taking pictures. We will share out the slides. You don't have to take too many pictures. How many of you recognize yourselves here, though, in one or another? How many of you consider yourselves to already be in that middle box? Excellent. How many of you are coming at it from the right-hand side in the server GIS first? Okay. And I'm going to assume the rest of you are coming at it more from the online first. Okay. With that said, it's about a lot more than just technology. Installing software, not installing software, choosing a pattern. Once you've actually chosen to go into the WebGIS world, you need to do a lot of thinking as well. Shannon, we'll talk more about that.
That switch over? I'll see something different. We can't see what you see. It's different though, right? Yeah. All right, great. Thank you, Philip. Philip's right. To be successful with your WebGIS requires more than just the technology. It requires the people, the planning, and the processes that are really going to be what makes you successful. Now, a lot of you raised your hands that you're already going with your WebGIS. And although these questions are high level, I encourage you to think about them again. Think about them and re-answer them and continue to revisit them through every year of your development, through every iteration of it. Ask yourself, are the answers to these questions the same as when I started? Or has something changed where I should adjust? So first, how will the members of your organization engage with your WebGIS? Who can access the content is probably the most basic question when it comes to WebGIS. I encourage you to be granular with this. Don't just say, my organization. Try to think of who it is specifically. Whose problems are you trying to solve? Who are you trying to get answers to? Who do you need to empower with your GIS? Those are the people that you are going to be supporting with your WebGIS. Those are the ones you want to access your content. Then what content can they access? Maybe you're serving a diverse group of people with different needs and different interests or different ability levels. Maybe you're serving power users and just your regular public consumer. What content can they access? How are you going to secure that? These are the questions that your organization should be asking and answering so that you can be successful with your WebGIS. Then finally, once you know who's accessing and what they're accessing, what are they going to be able to do with it? Are they going to be able to download your data? Are they going to be able to edit it? Are they going to be able to take part in self-serve mapping and create brand new projects that they can share out with the organization or maybe even with the world? There are some very basic answers to this. You can simply add users. That will get people in your organization. You can set groups of content or of users to say, there's the organizational data that you will have access to. And you can go through and set the fine-grained privileges for your custom roles. So that way, each of your users' roles are being met, and that the data and content that they are consuming is appropriate with what their business needs are. Many of us have started off GIS at the very beginning with paper maps. And while the days of paper maps are still alive and well, we need to start building web competency in our GIS teams. GIS is changing, and your team should be as well. To go from just simply making one print product to now thinking about the many facets of Web GIS. Training and educating your team on how they're now going to be curating the content, authoring maps, and configuring and developing apps. So that way your authoritative content not only looks great, but is something that the public or your users can use very easily and can be extremely streamlined, and that your GIS professionals are constantly being busy. Web GIS is not a replacement for GIS professionals of any means. It is instead a way that we can step up and be doing more in our organization. Now, instead of one print map that you have to go back and change when it gets marked up, you can enable your users to make the changes on the fly, and you can be able to empower the whole organization to take advantage of the situational awareness from your Web GIS. You also want to be engaging your users, expanding them out, thinking about the knowledge workers, executives, the operations teams, maybe your mobile workforce, or even the analysts. How is your Web GIS going to be able to serve them? What tools are you going to enable? What custom geoprocessing tools? Those are the questions that you are going to want to answer. And as you saw from the plenary, Jack said that there will be many new training resources freely available to your organization. I encourage you to take advantage of those, to help build that competency, to break down that wall of, well, this Web GIS thing might be too new and scary. Take it on, because it's going to be something that really empowers your organization as a whole. Secure executive sponsorship. This might sound scary to some, because in many large organizations, does the executive even know who the GIS team is? Have they seen them? Do they know where you sit? If you say in your own GIS bubble, then whereas that's great for your GIS, you lose touch with your users. You lose touch with how your GIS can be serving your organization. So if you evangelize within your team, perhaps you can location enable a small group of your organization. But if you are able to spread that GIS knowledge to members of the executive leadership, then that executive top-down will be able to help location enable a much larger portion of your organization. This is important because now you can have permeability of your Web GIS throughout your organization. Then you need to be able to align all the technology that Philip talked about with what your organization's specific needs are. Think about how you're going to implement. Is it going to be physical machines or virtualized environments, the cloud, or some combination thereof? For many of you, this might be a decision made by your IT departments. Or maybe you're a small GIS shop and you wear both the IT hat and the GIS hat, and this is up to you. Think about not only what you have available today, but what is going to fit the needs of your organization. Are you going to be putting products out there, like maybe an election map that you just know is going to go viral this election season? Well, maybe the cloud might be a great option. Or maybe you have your one physical machine and that's what you're comfortable with. Whatever the choice is for your organization, think through what is going to be, either by policy or by practice, the best choice for you. Think about how many machines you're going to need. Now, this is tricky. Consider the hardware specs. Consider what software components you're going to be installing. Best practices dictate, and I'm sure if you've gone to some of the other sessions, that you want to kind of separate out the different functions in your server. You don't want to overwhelm a machine because that will affect your performance. So think about how many machines are currently available. How can you maximize those to really optimize your GIS? And as Philip brought up, what deployment pattern do you see yourself in? And hopefully when you saw this, you not only thought about where you are today, but perhaps where you want to go next. Where will your organization grow into? Now, if you have federal or security requirements that force you to stay in your own infrastructure, that might be where you stay, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it's about knowing what options are out there and being able to talk about them with your organization so that way you know, your team knows, and your organization knows every Web GIS option that is available. And talking about those service level agreements, it is very easy for an executive or even a member of the GIS team to say 100%, we're going to be up 100% of the time. But it is nearly impossible to deliver that. I mean, as Philip said, ArcGIS Online is 3 nines of availability. I don't remember exactly what that equates to in downtime per year. But if you were to go to 5 nines, that would mean you had 5 minutes of downtime for the entire year. That's only a few seconds a month. When you think about how you're going to be upgrading or things that can happen in your network, that becomes very difficult to maintain. So think about and qualify the expectations of those executive leadership and even your team members in your organization. Downtime, while not ideal for any of us, is something that is necessary. And being able to talk to that and explain that this is not a matter of hours or days. This could be something as simple as minutes. But knowing what kind of data your Web GIS is needing to put out and what your organization's mission and goals are will help you define that. Now that you have SLAs and infrastructure and hardware and government, especially if you're going with the in your own infrastructure approach rather than the ArcGIS Online SaaS approach, you're going to want to partner with IT. Whereas we can wear many hats and do many great things, the IT professionals, this is what they do every day. So empower them to help serve your Web GIS. So now you can be focusing on serving the data and your customers, while IT can focus on applying the security, monitoring the systems, and enforcing the IT governance for your organization so that your users continue to have the most optimal experience of your Web GIS. Then once you've partnered with them, leverage the IT department to help you scale. So perhaps today your Web GIS is small. Maybe it's even a proof of concept running on your machine. For example, Philip and I are both running full Web GIS stacks on our MacBook Airs here. Our servers, our portals, our desktop applications, everything powered off our laptop.
Makes for good demos.
Makes for great demos. But if we were to suddenly have to power all of Esri from the portals that we have running on our local laptops, it would not go very well at all. So think about this with your organizations, that while you can serve yourself or maybe even a small team, if you had to suddenly scale to serve many more people, you're going to want to engage more technology, continue your partnership with IT so that you can have the load balancers, the web adapters, the multiple databases, and really bring everything together. Most importantly, just don't neglect your infrastructure. Where you are today might not be where you are tomorrow. And it's important that you think about how the changes are going to affect not only your organization as a whole, but your GIS infrastructure, and be sure that you're ready to scale to that capacity. As you grow, not only will it be new technology, new hardware and software you bring to the table, it will be new people as well. Your GIS and IT partnership supporting your users should also grow to include those subject matter experts. While as GIS experts, we can be subject matter experts for much of the data itself, but I know that when I was working with an oil company on pipeline GIS, I couldn't tell you if a certain kind of epoxy coating was appropriate for a certain type of pipe. I just couldn't. I wasn't that subject matter expert. But some of your users will be. And these people can help drive requirements, get those executive leadership excited about it, because those are the people that now your work and your efforts will equate to time saved, money saved. This could be something as simple as hours. It could be something as big as millions of dollars saved for your organization. They will champion your GIS for you, and they'll become your power users. So bring them in and help figure out what it is that they need from your Web GIS, what it is that you can do to help make sure your application is serving them. And be ever vigilant to your rest of your organization. Maybe a group that didn't need your Web GIS when you started setting everything up has now been changed, either by technology, your organization, or even by just the way the world has gone. And think about including them in. We'll get to questions at the end. So think about bringing them in. So that way you have a completely integrated Web GIS for your organization. How many of you have one mapping application that has every bit of data for your organization all in one place? How many of you have worked on one of those applications or seen them? I know I have. Philip and I lovingly call these Mapzillas. They're the mega maps, the maps that rule them all. Now I want you to think back to the plenary. Think about the LA hub that you saw. Think how effective that was, how easy it was for you to get the stories. Now think about what if instead they just made one giant map and put all the data in it. It would not be the same experience you saw. It wouldn't be as beautiful or as effective. Now many organizations have these Mapzillas. They have all the data all in one place. And there's kind of a twist on the 80-20 rule when it comes to those. 80% of the organization will be using about 20% of the data at any given time. But the trick is, within that 80%, all the individual groups will be using a different 20%. It gets very difficult to answer their questions or to be able to let your maps tell the stories that are really going to empower their decision making. By focusing your applications and taking advantage of either the SDKs, the APIs, the story maps, the configurable apps, the templates, any of the options that you have to really focus in that story, you can now empower your organization in ways that you weren't able to with your Mapzilla. It does require development planning. It does require a change, but it can be gradual. And you can start introducing these focus apps alongside your Mapzillas. So that way, your organization can now reach broader, have broader impact and reach more users. Think about your organizations. Now, this matrix you see before you, picture each of those dots as a problem that your Web GIS could solve. I know it can be very tempting when an executive or a member high in your organization comes and says, here's our toughest problem, can you solve it? And you immediately think, of course, we will solve it. But remember to set yourself up for success and go for those low-hanging fruit. Go for the highest organizational impact with the least amount of effort. It's not that you can't solve those big problems, those ones that are going to make a big impact but be very difficult. It's just that in parallel to those, look for those opportunities to really be successful. And don't underestimate design. I'm sure that throughout all of our GIS careers, we have seen things that in either Web GIS or in print GIS that made us cringe, that made us think, what were you doing? How did you pick those colors? And sometimes it's our own self-serve mappers meaning well, which is why Esri has created things like smart mapping to help make that a little easier. But beautiful maps make our data feel more authoritative to our users. They make them want to engage it, they want to use it, and want to show it off. And ultimately, that's what we want our users to do. We want them to be advocating the work that we're doing within our organization within their own user communities, and, if applicable, to the world. Everyone, at least that I know, wants to be known for a map that was just, wow, that is beautiful, that is something. No one, I've never met anyone that says, no, I'm okay with my map being the ugly one. Though sometimes, I'm sure they're out there somewhere. Then with all those focused apps and configurable map templates that Esri provides, remember, configure first. That will help set you up for success. But if that doesn't fit all your needs, you don't have to stop there. Don't be afraid to customize. Maybe that's changing the symbology. Maybe that's altering a template to pull in more data, or changing the defaults that one of those out-of-the-box templates provides. With just a little bit of code, or even, depending on what you want to do, no code at all, you can make your own maps look more customizable for your organization. And show your organization something they've never seen before. There are so many options, and GIS is constantly changing. There's so many opportunities to be able to show them a better way to answer a question that maybe they've been answering the same way for years. And maybe that's something that means that your organizations always use spreadsheets. Well, now, with the Maps for Office, you can bring maps into their spreadsheets and just blow their minds that way. Or maybe they've only looked at their data in 2D and never considered that their data might be applicable for 3D, might look beautiful in 3D, and might give them greater depth into the data's meaning. 3D is always a real showstopper. Story maps are a great way to show people the story of your data, where you started from and where you've gone to, or maybe where you're going to go next. You can show your organization so many different things, and every year there will be more to show. And that's something that GIS has that many industries don't. The ability to show beautiful, powerful, dynamic applications that we can use and reuse and modify to change the way that our organizations are solving problems. And once you've done all of that, once you've championed your applications, you've secured your executive sponsorship, you've qualified the expectations for your SLAs, you've created those partnerships and brought your users in, it's not time to stop. It's not time to rest, because you cannot just set and forget your Web GIS. They don't do very well that way. It's still technology. You can't lock it in a box and leave it there. Monitor your Web GIS always. Monitor your systems. Look at the people that you're serving. Are their needs changing? Is the organization changing? How can you adapt? Web GIS gives you the beautiful opportunity to be able to adapt quickly, change, pivot almost on a dime. And that's something that is just great and powerful. So look for those bottlenecks in your organization. Look for those low-hanging fruit. Look for the places where you can reduce risks. And look at all your technology, your implementation, your deployment patterns, and make sure you're really setting your organization to be as optimal as possible. Thanks.
With that, I want to just quickly go off what Shannon just said about planning and pull us back into this one diagram here. Because one of the often brought up planning processes that really challenges many organizations today is figuring out what bucket do I fall into here on this diagram. How do I make this choice? So I hope the information we've already given you helps you start that conversation with yourselves, your teams, and your organizations as a whole. One of the first things that I would recommend that you do is simply trying to figure out where you fit generally on this spectrum. Are you coming from the left or the right into the diagram? Are you subject to any kinds of policies or regulations that will naturally start pushing you towards the bottom versus the top? Or do you have a cloud-first preference? You want to get out of the business of running your own software, your own hardware, maintaining it. Does that mean cloud as in infrastructure as a service, or does that mean cloud as in software as a service? What are you more comfortable with? What will you be more comfortable with in the future? as Shannon just said, this is not a static choice. Once you make a decision, it's not that you now have to stay there forever. You may have some inertia. Nobody changes necessarily on a dime, even if the technology allows you to. But you should certainly keep in mind how to grow from where you start. Do you start by simply adding ArcGIS Online in front of an existing server and start with that second pattern from the left, and then grow into potentially adding Portal for ArcGIS yourself? What functional capabilities might be pushing you towards one versus the other? Right now, there's a lot of features that are being added on the software side that will eventually also come into the hosted model. For a while, we've also had the opposite be true. New features coming into the hosted model first, and then subsequently coming into the software approach. Sometimes this is because of release cadence, like I talked about in the beginning. Other times it's simply because there's not an easy way to create a hosted model out of it. 3D was the first example of something that actually came into the software first, and then only just recently came into ArcGIS Online. So sometimes there's a perception that online will be first, the software will be second because it releases faster, and that may be true in some cases. But the opposite can also be true. With Server at 10.4 and Portal, you can now share web layers, or as we would usually have said, publish map services from Pro to your server. But that today requires the use of Portal for ArcGIS and a Web GIS setup. So there's lots of nuance to this. What will be pushing you towards the right or the left, or the top or the bottom, depends on policy, regulation, functionality, and many other factors.
I think with that said,
thank you so much for coming this morning. We'll be taking questions for at least the next 5 to 10 minutes. We can have a lot of great debate.
One last thing is, if at any point, any of the questions we asked, you thought, oh my gosh, I do not know the answer, come down to the expo, to the Server GIS area. We have so many bright people there that can help you answer them. So don't be shy. Philip and I will be down there at some point. We have developers. We have everyone down there.
Thank you.
Question.